Here is Diamine's Writer's Blood, a magenta ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
This is perfectly named. The magenta is so deep and dark, it really takes on that dried blood look. This is quite dark and gives an almost black at times, but not really when you're looking at it. Not a big shading ink. However, when a color is this stand out good, as in interesting to see, it needs nothing else. It stands alone as amazing. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs just as well as on premium paper, but just avoid the gushers of a pen on the non-fountain pen friendly papers. The swatch is a true showing of what this looks like, but it looks even better in the writing sample. I have to say that my only regret with this ink is that I don't have a bottle of it.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Neponset with a music nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairefontaine.
Here we can see that really, really dark tone being from this wet pen. So dark, it's almost but not quite that black, and really has that pooled, dried blood look to it. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade, it looks gorgeous. It's so dark, I think it could pass in a professional environment as black. It's gorgeous on the page. Now, looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. I'm ignoring this because we had the same thing happen with the last writing sample, just on the edge. I think the paper's aging. I see nothing but good things here. So, great.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Diamine Chocolate Brown. Here is Diamine Claret. Here is Diamine Classic Green. Here is Diamine Classic Red.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
The tone we get here is the same as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does not shade. It does look amazing as a tone on the page. I can really see this being somebody's go-to ink. It is just truly amazing to look at. It's at times breathtaking, you might even say. Now, an unusual thing, see, on this paper, it usually does very well with fountain pen inks. You can see that it does have a slight bit of ghosting, but that spot right there did bleed through and make that little dot there. Is that the end of the world? No, this is a gusher of a pen, and everything sort of set against this paper for it. So while there was a tiny bit of bleed and while there is a tiny bit of ghosting, I do think with a less wet pen, this would be amazing, just not with a gusher.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
This gives a very interesting tone because you would expect if it were to change, it would get a little darker than it did on the Clairefontaine, but in fact, it gets a little bit lighter. Quite interesting to see. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. It still looks very nice. I think the background tone of this paper really brought out that blood look of it and makes this an amazing combination. As much as I like it on the other papers, here it's just doing wow. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have no problems, making this a constant winner.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
We have the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It also doesn't shade. Yes, it stands out against this quad rule with no problem, making this a very good ink on every paper that we've seen so far, including some that just don't show up on camera. It keeps that very dark but not black look to it. But most people might think of it as black if they're not really involved in this sort of stuff. With that, they'd still see it as odd as a black because it's not. Looking at the back of the page, this was really unfortunate. There's a very wet pen, but there's a ton of spots circled. This is where it came very deep into the paper. Almost through, but not through. It did not bleed through touching the page underneath, but this was very disappointing and is important to know. It might not be the best combination.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Pilot Susuji, or Azalea. Here is Robert Oster Claret. Here is Roher & Klinger Iron-Gall Scaviosa.
Here is Tag Kayona Oto Adzuki Iro. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Now, the tone that we're getting here is lighter, and we see more of the magenta here than we saw on any of the other papers. Really shows off some of that magenta in some of its lighter tones. Hint coming ahead. No feather, no spread. There are some moments of shading. Take a look at Old Smog on the second line, where the O is lighter than the L, and then it darkens a little bit more into the D. Now, Smog starts very dark with the S, lightens in the MAU, but much darker at the G at the end, really showing some beautiful shading, some beautiful characteristics. I kind of wish I was seeing this on some of the other papers, but then I would have to sacrifice it looking like dried blood. And who doesn't want to look like they're writing with dried blood? It gets people to leave you alone. Looking at the back of the page, there's nothing but smiles as we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is KWZ Blue Black. Here is Diatramentis Fog Gray. Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Yellow. Here is Diamine Quartz Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
This is the same tone that we had on the Clairefontaine. Very dark, very not exactly black, but almost looks like it could be black with a slight bit of a magenta look to it. The color's nice. The feathering and the spread is not nice. There's a lot of feathering all over the space. A bit distracting to me. Not something I would really go for. Shading does come through a few times. You see it on Feely on the second line where the F is a little bit darker than the IL, but the last I, little bit darker again. I just don't think this is a good combination. It's the feathering that really bothers me. Take a look at Bomber on the first line. It's just I guess if somebody were starting with fountain pens and they weren't dealing with a super feathery ink, they might be happy with this. Don't settle for this. Not this much feathering. One or two light ones every now and then, not a big deal, but this much, no. Looking at the disaster that is the back of the page, we see that it is almost completely showing through, though it did not bleed through to the page underneath, which was incredibly surprising to me. This does not belong on this paper, especially with a wet pen.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Noodler's Neponsit is a wet, very wet pen and puts a great tone down on the page. I have loved using this ink the entire time. Now, off camera, I decided to see if we could see something different out of it, and I decided to go with a medium flow fine, and it did tone down slightly, but still looked very nice and held on to that dried blood look to this color on the page. But for me, this really needs a wet pen. Any nib size will do, really, to show off the beautiful color that we're getting.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.